she laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that sliced through the grocery store's quiet hum. The old man's hands trembled as he fumbled with his wallet. Bills scattered across the counter like fallen leaves. His fingers, gnarled with age and something deeper, something earned, couldn't quite grasp the $20 bill. It fluttered to the floor. "Come on, Grandpa," the young cashier snorted, her name tag reading Jessica in bold letters. "We don't have all day." She rolled her eyes at the growing line behind him, performing for an audience that shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on his weathered face. He bent slowly, his joints protesting with each inch of movement. The tremor in his hands wasn't from age alone. It was from nights spent in muddy foxholes, from the weight of an M16, from explosions that still echoed in his dreams 50 years later. But Jessica didn't know that. None of them did. "Sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the store's background noise. "I'm sorry." He tried again to pick up the bill, his fingers betraying him once more. A woman behind him sighed loudly, checking her phone with exaggerated impatience. Jessica's laugh came again, louder this time. "Maybe you should have someone else do your shopping," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Someone whose hands actually work." The words hung in the air like a slap. Other customers looked away, suddenly fascinated by their own purchases, by the ceiling tiles, by anything except the quiet dignity being stripped away before their eyes. But she had no idea who she was laughing at. The old man finally managed to gather his money, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd learned patience in places where impatience could get you killed. He'd learned dignity in situations where dignity was all you had left. He counted out exact change, his trembling fingers handling each bill with the same precision he'd once used to field strip a rifle in the dark. "Thank you," he said softly, taking his receipt. His eyes met Jessica's for just a moment, and something flickered there. Not anger, not resentment, but a sadness that ran deeper than any wound. He'd seen that look before, in mirrors, in the faces of brothers who'd come home to a world that had moved on without them. As he shuffled toward the exit, his worn sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, Jessica turned back to her register with a satisfied smirk. The next customer stepped forward, but something was different now. The air felt heavier, charged with the weight of witnessed cruelty. The woman who'd sighed impatiently now looked uncomfortable, her eyes following the old man's retreating form. "Ken, you believe some people?" Jessica muttered, beginning to ring up the next order. But her words felt hollow now, echoing in a space that had grown suddenly quiet. Even the store's background music seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The old man reached the automatic doors, and they wheezed open with a mechanical sigh. He paused there for a moment, silhouetted against the afternoon sunlight, his shoulders carrying weight that had nothing to do with his grocery bags. Then he was gone, disappeared into a world that had forgotten how to see its heroes. If you believe that dignity doesn't have an expiration date, that respect isn't rationed by age, then hit that like button and subscribe, because some stories need to be told, and this one is just getting started. What happened next would change everything. Jessica thought she knew about respect, about judgment, and about the true cost of cruelty. It was during her break, 20 minutes after the old man had left, that Jessica first noticed the memorial wall. She'd worked at this store for 8 months, but she'd never really looked at it before. It hung behind her register, just to the left of the customer service counter, a wooden plaque surrounded by faded photographs and small American flags. "Local Heroes," the brass nameplate read, "in honor of those who served." Jessica glanced at it absently as she sipped her coffee, her mind already moving on to other things. The lunch rush would start soon, and she'd need to restock her bags and clean her scanner. She was still annoyed about the old man, about how he'd made her look bad in front of the other customers with his slow, fumbling movements. But something made her look closer. The photographs were old, some in black and white, others faded to sepia tones. Young faces stared back at her, boys really wearing uniforms that spoke of different wars, different times. Korea, Vietnam, some even older, World War II veterans. their faces smooth and hopeful in ways that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. The names were listed below in neat, precise lettering. Johnson, William R. Martinez, Carlos J. Thompson, Robert E., each name followed by dates, by service records, by brief descriptions of valor that could never truly capture what these men had given. She was about to turn away when her eyes caught on a name near the bottom of the list. A name that made her coffee cup slip from suddenly nerveless fingers, sending hot liquid splashing across the break room floor. Henderson, Frank J., United States Marine Corps. Vietnam War. Purple Heart. Bronze Star. 1968-1970. The description continued, but Jessica's vision blurred as she read the words that followed. Wounded in action during the Tet Offensive. Saved 6 fellow Marines while under heavy fire despite serious injuries to both hands. Suffered permanent nerve damage. Local resident since 1971. Her blood ran cold when she read that name again, when she saw the photograph beside it. It was him. 50 years younger, his face unlined, his eyes bright with purpose and hope. But it was unmistakably him. The same strong jaw, the same determined set to his shoulders, the same gentle eyes that had looked at her with such sadness just 20 minutes ago. Frank Henderson, the old man whose trembling hand she'd mocked, the man she'd humiliated in front of a store full of strangers, the hero whose sacrifice had been forgotten by everyone except the memorial wall that hung 3 feet behind her register. Jessica's legs gave out and she sank into a plastic chair, her mind reeling. The Purple Heart meant he'd been wounded in combat. The Bronze Star meant he'd been brave beyond measure. And the nerve damage, the permanent nerve damage to both hands, explained everything. The trembling, the difficulty with his wallet, the way he'd fumbled with his money. It wasn't age, it wasn't incompetence. It was the price he'd paid for saving 6 lives in a jungle halfway around the world. She thought about his whispered apologies, about the way he'd bent so carefully to pick up his fallen money. She thought about her laughter, sharp and cruel, cutting through the store like shrapnel. She thought about the way other customers had looked away, embarrassed not by him but by her behavior, by the cruelty they'd witnessed. Frank Henderson had earned those shaking hands in service to his country. He'd earned them pulling wounded Marines from the line of fire while bullets whistled overhead and mortar shells shook the earth. He'd earned them in a place where young men died far from home, where courage was measured not in words but in actions, in the willingness to sacrifice everything for the person next to you. And she had laughed at him. The break room felt too small. Suddenly, the walls pressing in around her. Jessica stumbled to her feet, coffee still dripping from the table, and walked back to her register on unsteady legs. The memorial wall seemed to glow now, impossible to ignore, the faces of local heroes watching her with eyes that had seen too much. But the story gets even more powerful when you understand what Frank Henderson really did in Vietnam, and why. His sacrifice should matter to every single one of us. The official military records told only part of Frank Henderson's story. Jessica spent her lunch break in the store's back office, her manager's computer screen glowing as she searched through newspaper archives and military databases. What she found made her stomach turn and her heart break in equal measure. February 15th, 1968. Firebase Charlie, 30 miles northwest of Saigon. Lance Corporal Frank Henderson, 19 years old, had been in country for exactly 4 months and 6 days. The Tet Offensive was raging across South Vietnam, and Firebase Charlie was about to become another casualty statistic. The attack came at dawn, waves of North Vietnamese regulars supported by mortar fire and rocket-propelled grenades. Frank's squad was positioned in a forward bunker when the first explosion collapsed half the structure, trapping 6 Marines under twisted metal and concrete. Enemy fire raked the position, making rescue impossible for anyone except the one Marine who could still move. Frank Henderson crawled through that hellfire 3 times, 3 separate trips through machine gun fire and mortar blasts, each time dragging a wounded Marine to safety. On his second trip, shrapnel from an exploding mortar round shredded both his hands, sending hot metal through tendons and nerves. On his third trip, a bullet grazed his skull, filling his eyes with blood, but he kept going. While his hands bled, and his vision blurred. While bullets sparked off the concrete around him, Frank Henderson made 3 more trips into that collapsed bunker. 6 Marines owed their lives to a 19-year-old kid from small-town America who refused to leave anyone behind. The nerve damage was immediate and permanent. The doctors at the field hospital said he'd never regain full use of his hands, that the tremors would likely worsen with age. But Frank Henderson was alive, and so were the 6 men he'd pulled from that bunker. That was what mattered to him then, and it was what mattered to him now, 53 years later, when a young cashier laughed at the price he'd paid for their lives. Jessica stared at the computer screen, at the black and white photograph of a field hospital in Vietnam. Frank Henderson, barely out of his teens, lying on a stretcher with bandaged hands, smiling despite everything because his brothers were alive. The citation for his Bronze Star mentioned his extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty, but those words felt inadequate somehow, too small to contain the reality of what he'd done. She thought about the way he'd counted his money. That morning, each bill handled with such care despite the tremor in his fingers. She thought about his whispered apologies, about the patience he'd shown even as she mocked him. How many times had he endured this kind of treatment? How many times had strangers judged him by his shaking hands, never knowing they were looking at a hero? The worst part was the silence, the way other customers had looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak up. Frank Henderson had fought for their freedom to stand in that grocery store, to buy their food in safety, to live their lives without fear. And when he needed someone to stand up for him, they had all looked away. Jessica's phone buzzed with a text from her boyfriend. "How's work? Any crazy customers today?" She stared at the message, unable to respond. How could she explain what she'd done? How could she tell him that she'd mocked a war hero, that she'd laughed at the hands that had saved 6 lives in a jungle firefight? Her shift ended in 3 hours, but she knew she couldn't wait that long. She had to find Frank Henderson. She had to apologize to try to make this right somehow. But how do you apologize for laughing at someone's sacrifice? How do you take back cruelty that cuts so deep? The memorial wall watched her as she worked, Frank's young face a constant reminder of what she'd done. Other customers came and went, their transactions routine and forgettable. But every time she saw an elderly person, every time someone's hands shook slightly as they reached for their wallet, Jessica felt the weight of her actions settling deeper into her chest. She had learned something today that would change her forever. She had learned that heroes don't always look like heroes, that sacrifice often wears the quiet face of an elderly man buying groceries. She had learned that some wounds never heal, that some prices are paid for a lifetime. And she had learned that sometimes the person you mock might be the very person who made it possible for you to stand where you're standing. But would she have the courage to face Frank Henderson again? Would she be able to look into those gentle eyes and admit what she'd done wrong? Frank Henderson lived in a small duplex on Maple Street, 8 blocks from the grocery store. Jessica found his address in the phone book. He was one of the last people in town who still had a landline listing. She sat in her car outside his house for 20 minutes after her shift ended, trying to find the words she needed to say. The house was modest but well maintained, with a small front garden full of tomatoes and peppers. An American flag hung from a pole by the front door, its fabric worn but clean. A Purple Heart decal was barely visible in the corner of his living room window, faded by years of sunlight. When Jessica finally knocked, her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he'd hear it through the door. Footsteps approached slowly, and she could hear the scrape of a security chain being moved aside. The door opened, and Frank Henderson stood there in a cardigan sweater and slippers, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. "You're the young lady from the grocery store," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just a gentle observation that made Jessica's guilt even worse. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her voice cracking. I came to apologize. What I did today was wrong. It was cruel and ignorant, and I'm so sorry." He studied her face for a long moment, those same gentle eyes that had looked at her with such sadness just hours ago. Then he stepped back and gestured for her to come in. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a pot." His living room was neat and sparse, decorated with photographs from his military service and later life. Jessica recognized some of the faces from the memorial wall. Fellow veterans, fellow survivors of wars that had ended decades ago but still lived in their memories. A folded flag sat in a place of honor on the mantel, probably from a friend's funeral. Frank's hands shook as he poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, but he managed without spilling a drop. The tremor was more pronounced now, Jessica noticed, probably worse when he was tired or stressed. She wanted to help, but she didn't know if her assistance would be welcome or if it would just make things worse. "I saw the memorial wall," she said quietly, accepting the mug with both hands. "I saw your picture, your service record. I had no idea." "Most people don't," Frank replied, settling into a worn armchair across from her. "And that's okay. I didn't serve for recognition. None of us did. But your hands," Jessica pressed, tears starting to blur her vision. "The nerve damage. I laughed at your sacrifice, at the price you paid for saving those Marines. I don't know how to live with that." Frank was quiet for a long time, sipping his coffee and watching her cry. When he finally spoke, his voice was even gentler than before. "Do you know what the hardest part of coming home was?" Jessica shook her head, not trusting her voice. "It wasn't the nightmares, though. I had plenty of those. It wasn't the pain in my hands, though that took some getting used to. It was the feeling that nobody cared anymore, that the war was over for everyone, except the people who fought it." He set his mug down carefully, his hands trembling slightly with the movement. "But today, when you laughed, I didn't think about Vietnam or the war or any of that. I just thought about how I'd rather have been anywhere else in the world than standing in that store." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. She had made a war hero wish he could disappear. She had made a man who'd risked everything for his country feel ashamed of the hands that had saved 6 lives. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, the words feeling inadequate and hollow. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Henderson. If you believe that our veterans deserve better than this, that heroism should be honored regardless of age, then subscribe and share this story. Because Frank Henderson's next words would teach Jessica a lesson about forgiveness that would change her life forever." Frank Henderson leaned forward in his chair, his eyes meeting Jessica's directly. The tears on her cheeks caught the lamplight, and for a moment he saw not the cruel young woman from the store, but someone else. Someone who reminded him of his own daughter, if he'd had one. Someone young enough to learn, to change, to be better. "You know what I learned in Vietnam?" he said softly. "I learned that we're all just people, trying to do our best with what we've got. Some days we succeed, and some days we fail. Today you failed, but you're here now. That counts for something." Jessica looked up at him through her tears, amazed by the kindness in his voice. How could he be so gentle with her after what she'd done? How could he offer her forgiveness when she hadn't even forgiven herself? "Those Marines I pulled out of that bunker," Frank continued, "they weren't perfect people. One of them used to cheat at cards. Another one had a terrible temper. But when the moment came, when they needed help, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were worth saving, just like everyone else." He gestured around the room, at the photographs and memories that filled his small space. "I've lived with these hands for over 50 years. They shake, they don't work the way they used to, but they're still my hands. They're still part of the story of those 6 lives that came home because of what they did." Jessica wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "How do you do it? How do you keep going when people treat you like that?" "Because most people don't," Frank replied simply. "Most people are kind, or at least indifferent. It's only once in a while that you meet someone who's forgotten how to see other people as human beings. But even then, even today, I have to remember that you're human too, that you're capable of growth, of being better than your worst moment." Forgiveness in his words was almost too much to bear. Jessica had come here expecting anger, maybe even rejection. Instead, she'd found grace in a form she'd never encountered before. The grace of someone who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, and still chose to believe in its capacity for good. "What can I do?" she asked. "How can I make this right?" Frank smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "You already are, by being here, by caring enough to apologize, by seeing me as more than just my shaking hands. That's more than most people would do." But Jessica shook her head. "That's not enough. There has to be something more." Frank considered this, his trembling fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. "Well," he said finally, "there is one thing. At the store, on that memorial wall, there are other names there, other veterans, other stories. Most of them are gone now, but their families are still here. Their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. Maybe you could learn their stories too. Maybe you could help other people see what I hope you're starting to see." The idea took root in Jessica's mind immediately. She could research each name on that wall, learn their stories, share them with customers and co-workers. She could make sure that the next time an elderly veteran came through her line, she'd see them not as an inconvenience, but as someone whose sacrifice had made her life possible. "I'll do that," she promised. "I'll learn every story on that wall." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good. But remember, it's not just about the veterans. It's about seeing everyone as someone with a story worth knowing. The elderly woman counting change, the young father juggling kids and groceries, the teenager buying their first car payment with crumpled bills. Everyone has struggles. Everyone has victories. Everyone deserves patience." As Jessica prepared to leave, Frank walked her to the door. His movements were slow but steady, and she noticed how he used his hands despite their limitations. Opening doors, straightening picture frames, living his life with the dignity that no amount of mockery could take away. "Thank you," she said, at the threshold. "For your service, for your forgiveness, for teaching me something I should have learned a long time ago." "Thank you for caring enough to learn it," Frank replied. "That's what gives me hope. That people like you are willing to grow to be better. That's what makes all of it worthwhile." The next morning, Jessica arrived at work 30 minutes early. She spent the time standing in front of the memorial wall, reading every name, studying every photograph. Frank Henderson's young face looked back at her from among the others, but now she saw him differently. She saw all of them differently, not as dusty relics of forgotten wars, but as young men who'd given everything for the freedom she took for granted every day. When her shift began, she had a new purpose. The first elderly customer of the day was Mrs. Patterson, a woman in her 70s who always paid with exact change counted out slowly from a small coin purse. Jessica had been impatient with her before, had rolled her eyes at the careful way she counted each penny, but today was different. Today Jessica saw Mrs. Patterson's methodical counting as dignity, as someone managing on a fixed income with the same pride Frank Henderson had shown in that collapsed bunker in Vietnam. She waited patiently, smiled genuinely, and even helped bag the groceries without being asked. The store manager noticed the change immediately. "You seem different today, Jessica. More present." She was present. For the first time in her 8 months at the store, she was truly seeing the people who came through her line. She was seeing their stories, their struggles, their humanity. And in each interaction, she was remembering Frank Henderson's lesson about forgiveness, about the capacity for growth, about the importance of seeing everyone as someone worth saving. The memorial wall behind her register was no longer just decoration. It was a reminder, a promise, a call to be better than her worst moment. And every time she looked at Frank Henderson's young face smiling back at her from 1968, she remembered that heroes don't always look like heroes. Sometimes they look like elderly men buying groceries with trembling hands, hands that had once pulled 6 Marines from a collapsed bunker while bullets flew overhead. That evening, Jessica began her research. She started with the name at the top of the memorial. Wall, William R. Johnson, World War II veteran, killed in action at Normandy 3 days after D-Day. She found his story in the local newspaper archives, learned about the young man who'd written letters home about wanting to be a teacher, who died on a beach in France at age 22. But the story gets even more powerful when you understand how Jessica's transformation began to ripple outward, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. Word traveled fast in a small town. By the end of the week, everyone knew about Jessica's visit to Frank Henderson's house, about her newfound respect for the memorial wall, about the way she'd started treating every customer with dignity and patience. The story spread through church groups and coffee shops, through the networks of conversation that bind small communities together. Other employees at the store began to take notice. Mark, the teenager who worked weekend shifts, started asking Jessica about the names on the memorial wall. Sarah, the part-time cashier, began waiting patiently when elderly customers needed extra time. Even the store manager implemented a new policy. All employees would spend time learning about the local veterans honored on their memorial wall. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hawkins, an 83-year-old woman who'd been shopping at the store for decades, approached Jessica's register on a busy Saturday afternoon. Her husband had been one of the names on the memorial wall, Robert E. Thompson, killed in Korea in 1951. "I heard what you did," Mrs. Hawkins said quietly as Jessica rang up her groceries. "How you went to see Frank, how you apologized. Robert would have liked that. He always said the hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves." Jessica's eyes welled up as she carefully bagged Mrs. Hawkins' items. "Tell me about him," she said. "Tell me about Robert." And Mrs. Hawkins did. She told Jessica about the young man who'd wanted to be a carpenter, who'd built her a jewelry box before he shipped out to Korea, who'd died holding a hill against overwhelming odds so that his unit could retreat safely. She told her about 68 years of missing him, of raising their children alone, of visiting his grave every Sunday for over half a century. "He was just a boy," Mrs. Hawkins said, her voice thick with memory. 20 years old, scared of dying so far from home. But he did his duty. They all did their duty. Word of these conversations began to spread beyond the store. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the memorial wall, interviewing Jessica, about her transformation and the lessons she'd learned from Frank Henderson. The story was picked up by the regional paper, then by a military veterans website, then by social media networks where it was shared thousands of times. Frank Henderson became something of a local celebrity, though he handled the attention with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in the grocery store that day. He gave interviews to the newspaper, visited the high school to speak to history classes, and even attended a ceremony where the store officially rededicated its memorial wall with improved lighting and expanded information about each veteran. But the real change was smaller, more personal. It was in the way Jessica now greeted every customer, the way she listened to their stories, the way she saw each person who came through her line as someone with a history worth knowing. It was in the way other employees followed her example, creating a ripple effect of kindness that spread throughout the store and into the community. The store's customer satisfaction scores reached an all-time high. Corporate headquarters took notice, sending representatives to study what they called the culture of respect that had developed at the small-town location. They wanted to replicate it in other stores, to bottle whatever magic had transformed a routine grocery store into a place where every customer felt valued and seen. But Jessica knew the magic wasn't something that could be packaged or duplicated through corporate training programs. It was something simpler and more profound. The recognition that every person carries invisible wounds and invisible victories. That everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their age or appearance or the steadiness of their hands. 3 months after that terrible day in the grocery store, Jessica found herself back at Frank Henderson's house. But this time she wasn't alone. She'd brought her nephew, a 17-year-old who was considering military service, who wanted to hear about real heroism from someone who'd lived it. Frank welcomed them both with the same gentle kindness he'd shown that first evening. He told stories about Vietnam, about the friends he'd lost and the friends he'd saved, about the weight of survival and the responsibility of memory. He showed them his medals, not with pride but with solemnity, explaining that each one represented not his courage, but the sacrifice of men who hadn't come home. As they prepared to leave, Jessica's nephew shook Frank's trembling hand with both of his own. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, and Jessica could hear in his voice the respect and understanding that she'd failed to show that day in the store. "Thank you for caring enough to listen," Frank replied. "That's all any of us really want, to be remembered, to have our stories matter to someone." On the drive home, Jessica's nephew was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I never thought about it before. How the old people I see every day might have done incredible things when they were young. How they might still be heroes even if they don't look like heroes anymore." That was the moment Jessica knew Frank Henderson's lesson had taken root in another generation. The respect, the understanding, the recognition of hidden heroism, it was spreading, person by person, story by story, handshake by handshake. The memorial wall at the grocery store was no longer just a forgotten decoration. It had become a living reminder of the price of freedom, of the ongoing presence of heroes in everyday life, of the importance of seeing past appearances to the truth of who people really are. Frank Henderson still shopped at the store every Tuesday morning. His hands still shook as he counted his money, but now Jessica and her co-workers saw those trembling fingers for what they really were. Hands that had saved lives, hands that had served with honor, hands that had earned their unsteadiness in the service of others. And every time he came through her line, Jessica was reminded of the person she'd been and the person she'd chosen to become. She was reminded that growth is possible, that forgiveness is powerful, and that sometimes the greatest lessons come from the people we least expect to teach us. The story could have ended there, with lessons learned and relationships healed. But life has a way of coming full circle, of testing whether the changes we make in ourselves are deep enough to last when faced with real challenges. It was a Thursday morning in late November when Jessica saw the familiar figure shuffling through the store's automatic doors. Frank Henderson moved more slowly than usual, his steps uncertain, his usual Tuesday routine disrupted by what looked like an unscheduled shopping trip. Something was different about him, a fragility that hadn't been there before, a hesitation in his movements that spoke of recent struggle. Jessica watched him navigate the aisles with growing concern. He seemed confused, stopping in front of displays as if trying to remember what he'd come to buy. His hands shook more than usual as he reached for items, and twice she saw him steady himself against the shopping cart, as if the simple act of standing had become difficult. When he finally reached her register, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. His face was pale, and there was a slight tremor in his voice when he greeted her. "Good morning, Jessica. How are you today?" "I'm well, Mr. Henderson. How are you feeling?" She kept her voice gentle, noticing how he fumbled with his wallet more than usual, how the simple task of paying seemed to require all his concentration. "Oh, I'm fine," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Just had a little spell at the doctor's office yesterday. Nothing serious." But Jessica could see it was serious. She could see it in the way he gripped the counter for support, in the way he blinked slowly as if trying to clear his vision. She could see it in the tremor that had spread from his hands to his entire body, subtle but unmistakable to someone who'd learned to really look at him. As she bagged his groceries, Jessica made a decision that surprised even her. "Mr. Henderson, would you like me to help you to your car with these?" He started to protest, to insist he could manage, but something in her expression stopped him. "That would be very kind," he said quietly. "Thank you." Walking beside him through the parking lot, Jessica noticed how slowly he moved, how carefully. He placed each step. His car, an old sedan kept in pristine condition, seemed impossibly far away. When they reached it, his hands shook so badly that he couldn't get the key into the lock. "Here, let me help," Jessica said, gently taking the keys from his trembling fingers. She opened the trunk, loaded his groceries, then helped him to the driver's door. But as she handed him the keys, she realized she couldn't let him drive home alone. "Mr. Henderson," she said carefully, "I don't think you should be driving today. You seem unwell." For a moment, pride flickered in his eyes, the same stubborn independence that had carried him through a war and 50 years of civilian life. But then reality settled over his features like a shadow, and his shoulders sagged with the weight of acknowledgement. "You're probably right. he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed to get out of the house. Needed to feel normal for a little while. Jessica's heart broke at the loneliness in his confession. Here was a man who'd faced enemy fire without flinching, now struggling with the simple act of buying groceries, fighting a battle against his own failing body with the same quiet courage he'd shown in Vietnam. "Why don't I drive you home?" she offered. "I can call my manager, explain the situation. Someone can pick up your car later." Frank looked at her with surprise, then with something deeper. Gratitude mixed with a kind of wonder that someone would care enough to disrupt their day for an old man's dignity. "I couldn't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," Jessica replied firmly. "I'm offering. Mr. Henderson, you taught me something important about seeing people as they really are. Let me show you that I learned the lesson." The drive to his house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and Frank's occasional directions. Jessica could see him struggling to stay alert, his head nodding slightly as fatigue overcame him. When they reached his duplex, she helped him from the car, noticing how he leaned on her more than he probably wanted to admit. Inside his house, she helped him settle into his familiar armchair and made him a cup of tea with shaking hands that mirrored his own, though hers shook from emotion rather than illness. The photographs on his mantel seemed to watch over them, young faces from a distant war bearing witness to this moment of quiet care. "The doctor says it's just age," Frank said after a few sips of tea had steadied his voice. "The tremors are getting worse, affecting my balance now. He wants me to consider assisted living." The words came out like a physical pain, each syllable a small defeat. Jessica sat across from him, remembering their first conversation in this same room, when she'd been the one needing comfort and understanding. Now the roles had reversed, but the fundamental lesson remained the same. Everyone deserves dignity, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Frank's laugh was bitter. "I want to be 20 years old again, carrying a 60-pound pack through the jungle without breaking a sweat. I want my hands to work the way they used to. I want to not be a burden to anyone." He paused, looking around the room that contained a lifetime of memories. But wanting and getting are two different things, aren't they? Over the next hour, Jessica learned more about Frank Henderson's current reality than she'd ever known about his past heroism. He told her about the nights when he couldn't sleep because the tremors were too severe, about the mornings when simple tasks like buttoning his shirt became insurmountable challenges. He told her about the loneliness of aging without family, about friends who'd passed away one by one until he was left carrying the memories of an entire generation. But he also told her about the small victories, successfully making his morning, coffee, completing a crossword puzzle, maintaining his independence for one more day. He spoke of these modest achievements with the same quiet pride he might have once reserved for military commendations, and Jessica began to understand that heroism takes many forms throughout a lifetime. When it was time for her to leave, Frank walked her to the door with careful, measured steps. "Thank you," he said, "for the ride, for listening, for caring about an old soldier who's running out of battles to fight." "You're not running out of battles," Jessica replied. "You're just fighting different ones now, and you're not fighting them alone." That evening, Jessica couldn't stop thinking about Frank's situation. She thought about the assisted living comment, about his obvious reluctance to give up his independence, about the loneliness that seemed to permeate his small house despite its carefully maintained dignity. She thought about all the other elderly veterans in their community who might be facing similar struggles in silence. An idea began to form in her mind, something that started as a simple desire to help one person, but gradually expanded into something larger. The next morning, she approached her store manager with a proposal that surprised them both. "I want to start a program," she said, "a way for store employees to connect with elderly customers who might need assistance. Not just veterans, but anyone who's struggling with shopping, transportation, or basic errands." Her manager, a practical man who'd learned to value Jessica's insights since her transformation, listened carefully as she outlined her vision. Volunteer employees could offer to help with grocery shopping, provide rides to medical appointments, or simply check in on isolated community members. The store could serve as a coordination point, connecting people who needed help with people who were willing to provide it. It's not a business expense, Jessica explained. It's community service. It's showing that we see our customers as neighbors, not just sources of revenue. The program launched quietly, with Jessica as its first volunteer and Frank Henderson as its first recipient. But word spread quickly through the networks of small-town communication. Other employees volunteered, customers asked how they could help, and local organizations offered support and resources. Within 3 months, what had started as one young woman's desire to help one elderly veteran had become a community-wide initiative. The Neighbor-to-Neighbor program, as it came to be known, was helping dozens of elderly residents maintain their independence while ensuring they had support when they needed it. Frank Henderson became not just a recipient of the program's services, but one of its most effective advocates. He spoke at community meetings, sharing his story and encouraging other veterans to accept help when it was offered. His message was simple, but powerful. Accepting assistance isn't a sign of weakness. It's a recognition that we all need each other, especially as we age. I spent 60 years trying to be completely independent, he told one gathering. But I've learned that true strength sometimes means letting other people care about you. Jessica taught me that when she knocked on my door to apologize. Now she's teaching the whole community. The program's success attracted attention from veterans organizations, senior service agencies, and even state government officials interested in replicating the model in other communities. But for Jessica, the real measure of success was much simpler. It was the smile on Frank's face when she arrived for their weekly grocery trip, the confidence in his voice when he knew he had reliable transportation to medical appointments, the way other elderly customers had begun to see the store not just as a place to shop, but as a place where they were valued and supported. 6 months after that November morning when she'd driven Frank home, Jessica received a phone call that changed everything. Frank had been rushed to the hospital with pneumonia, his condition serious enough that doctors weren't sure he would recover. She arrived at the hospital to find him connected to oxygen, his breathing labored, his skin pale and drawn. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw her, he managed a weak smile. "You came," he whispered through the oxygen mask. "Of course I came," Jessica replied, taking his trembling hand in both of hers. "Your family." Over the next week, Jessica spent every free moment at Frank's bedside. She read him letters from other program participants, updates about the community initiative he'd helped inspire, news from the store where his memorial wall photograph had become a symbol of the transformation one act of cruelty and subsequent redemption could create. Other visitors came too, veterans from the American Legion post where Frank had been, a quiet member for decades, employees from the store who'd learned to see him as more than just another customer, neighbors who'd been touched by the Neighbor-to-Neighbor program. His hospital room became a gathering place for people whose lives he'd influenced, often without even realizing it. On the 7th day, as Jessica sat beside his bed, reading him a letter from her nephew, now a Marine recruit who credited Frank's stories with inspiring his service, she felt his hand squeeze hers with surprising strength. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice clearer than it had been in days. "About that day in the store, when you laughed at my hands. I want you to know that what happened after, your apology, your friendship, everything you've done, it gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Jessica asked, leaning closer. "Purpose," Frank replied. "For 50 years, I've carried the weight of those 6 Marines I pulled from that bunker. Not regret, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But responsibility. The feeling that I had to justify their survival by living a life worthy of their sacrifice. I never felt like I'd done enough." He paused, gathering strength for what he needed to say. "But watching you grow, watching you help others grow, seeing the program we started together, for the first time in decades, I feel like maybe I did justify their sacrifice. Maybe the lesson you learned and the lessons you've taught others are part of what they died for. Maybe their sacrifice is still saving lives, just in a different way." Jessica felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood the profound gift Frank was giving her. He was telling her that her transformation, Her growth from that moment of cruelty to this life of service had given meaning to sacrifices made in a jungle 55 years ago. He was telling her that redemption is possible, that growth matters, that one person's change can ripple across generations. Frank Henderson recovered from his pneumonia, but the experience changed both of them. They both understood now that their time together was precious and limited, that every conversation, every shared meal, every quiet moment was a gift not to be taken for granted. The Neighbor-to-Neighbor program continued to grow, eventually expanding to serve over 100 elderly residents across 3 counties. Jessica left her job at the grocery store to coordinate the program full-time, but she never forgot the memorial wall that had started her journey or the lesson she'd learned about seeing past appearances to the truth of who people really are. As Frank grew older and more frail, their relationship evolved from volunteer and recipient to something deeper. The bond between a teacher and student, between generations connected by shared purpose. Jessica helped him navigate the challenges of aging, while he continued to share the wisdom earned through a lifetime of service and sacrifice. And on quiet Tuesday mornings, when they made their weekly grocery trip together, Jessica would sometimes catch a glimpse of the young Marine in Frank's patient smile, the hero who'd crawled through enemy fire to save his brothers. The tremor in his hands remained, a permanent reminder of the price he'd paid for their lives. But now those same hands were surrounded by care and respect, held by people who understood their value, honored by a community that had learned to see its heroes regardless of their age or appearance. If you believe that every elderly person you meet might be carrying invisible stories of courage and sacrifice, if you think dignity should be a right rather than a privilege, then share this story and let others know that heroes walk among us every day. Sometimes they look exactly like the person you might otherwise overlook. The elderly man counting change with trembling hands, the woman moving slowly through the grocery store, the veteran whose uniform hangs in a closet but whose service lives on in the freedom we all enjoy. Take a moment to really see the people around you, to recognize that everyone has a story worth knowing, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the people we're quickest to dismiss. Frank Henderson taught Jessica that heroism doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It continues in the quiet dignity of daily life, in the grace we show others, and in the courage we find to grow beyond our worst moments into our best selves. What story might you discover if you looked past appearances to see the person standing in front of you?